Welcome to the Nordic Institute of Latin American Studies at Stockholm University. My name is Thaïs Machado Borges, and I'm the director of the Institute. We are very thankful to be able to host, together with the Edelstam Foundation, such an important event of remembrance, marking 50 years since the coup in Chile on September 11, 1973. Today's event, entitled Undoing the Coup, invites us to reflect on issues related to democracy, human rights, memory, justice, and solidarity. Our work at the Institute spans over three important areas: education, research, and contact with the civil society. The present event unites these areas of activities and gives us the opportunity to strengthen our links with the Chilean diaspora in Sweden and with Swedes engaged in the Chilean cause. My warmest welcome to the panel participants and to the audience here and online. Thank you. We are streaming this webinar, so people online will have the possibility to follow the event but not ask questions. And we are not filming the event. The Stockholm University is not filming the event, but there are other people filming it, so that you know. So welcome, and I'll give the word to Dr. Brian Palmer, who is going to moderate this event. So Brian.
The title of the seminar, Undoing the Coup, brims with hope. How can one possibly undo the horrors of a military coup against a democratic government, followed by a dictatorship that relied on torture to terrorize the population? The theme brings to mind the work of Harvard professor Elaine Scarry in her classic study of torture and war, The Body in Pain. She writes of Chile on this day and this year, 50 years ago. I quote, she's here describing acts of solidarity. Quote, "The imprisoned Chilean women who on Christmas Eve sang with all their might to their men in a separate camp the song that they had written, 'Take heart, Jose, my love,' and who, through the abusive shouts of guards ordering silence, heard faintly on the wind the answering song of the men." End quote. Scarry's book concludes that such acts of solidarity, including support from people in other nations, are almost physiological in their power of alteration and repair. She writes, quote, "Acts that restore the voice of the tortured person become not only a denunciation of the pain, but almost a diminution of the pain, a partial reversal of the process of torture itself." End quote. So yes, the world has been undoing the coup for 50 years. Today in this room and in similar gatherings all over the world, from Santiago to Madrid to the Brooklyn Museum in New York, people are meeting to continue the work of undoing the coup. So with those words about the title of our event, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Caroline Edelstam, the president of the Edelstam Foundation, who has helped organize this event and many other important gatherings about the past and present of Chile. Please welcome Caroline Edelstam.
My name is Caroline Edelstam, and as Brian said, I'm working with the Edelstam Foundation, but I am also the granddaughter of Ambassador Harald Edelstam, who was the Swedish ambassador in Chile in 1973. So we are today commemorating the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile. A brutal overthrow of Chile's democratically elected president, which shocked the world and marked the start of a repressive 16 years dictatorship led by General Augusto Pinochet. This led to thousands of victims of human rights violations in Chile, where thousands of individuals were tortured and murdered. Terrible crimes and abuses occurred after the coup. Straight after the coup happened, my grandfather started the important work to protect people who were being persecuted by their own government. When he arrived in Chile in 1972, his mission was first and foremost to transmit Swedish assistance to the government coalition, Unidad Popular. Just right after the coup, he started to drive around the city looking for people who needed protection. He used his diplomatic immunity to talk to the military junta. He opened up the Swedish embassy's doors so people can come and seek refuge, and he was encouraging all the staff to do the same and to really talk to the diplomatic community that they should open up their embassies. He made no distinction in background, only it was people with very different background, many people who were politically active that needed support. Many people had fled from dictatorships in Uruguay and in Brazil, and then came to Chile, and there was another coup. And he could offer them safe conduct to an asylum in Sweden. A big problem he encountered was that he really tried to convince his diplomatic colleagues to open up their embassies and to help people in need, but there was a very shallow interest in this. Another very important thing he did was that he actually alerted the international media of what was happening in the country and encouraged them to write about the situation and use the right terms for what was actually happening. In endless discussions with the junta, he managed to negotiate that they would release that person or that person. He was investigating where people were imprisoned. He kept track of persecuted persons, and every day he went to the concentration camp at the National Stadium to see if he could get one person released, another one there. And he gave orders to his staff to do the same. And they were not very convinced either, because they didn't want to do anything wrong working for the Swedish government. Dead people arrived in trucks to the stadium. Trucks with arrested people arrived to the stadium. He managed somehow to get into the arena through very clever and convincing and exhausting methods. The junta went really tired of him and did not really appreciate it. There was this Colonel Espinosa, who was in charge of the whole national stadium. And my grandfather would always go straight up to him and ask for a meeting. And Espinosa, he got very surprised by this and also a bit flattered because no one else wanted meetings with him. So he managed to get in, and he did his ordinary tour every day at the arena of the stadium. Major action he did was that his neighbor, the Cuban embassy, was besieged by the junta. So they were standing shooting at this Cuban embassy. My grandfather went in and said, if you shoot at me, you declare, the ground I'm standing on is Swedish. If you shoot at me, you declare war with Sweden. And the young soldiers perplexed because they didn't know how to act. Is it true? Will we create a war with Sweden? So he went into the Swedish embassy, took down the Swedish flag, brought it into the Cuban embassy and hailed the Swedish flag and said, I now declare this territory to be Swedish. So they were very surprised by all this and had nothing to say for the contrary. He managed to save all the staff at the Cuban embassy, and he himself was really happy that he had one more venue to host people in. Problem because he had not asked his ministry if it was okay to take over the Cuban embassy. But thankfully he was a friend of the Prime Minister in Sweden at the time, Mr. Olof Palme, and he called him home in the kitchen and said, hi, I did something today. So the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs were, first of all, they were not really aware of what he was doing in Chile. And the staff at the embassy thought it was a difficult situation because he was the boss, but they still didn't comply really with the Swedish regulations on this. And there he had this mentality of, they would say, have you informed the ministry in Sweden? And he would say, yes. Then he had sent a letter with a boat he knew would take 6 months. But he still had informed the Swedish embassy. Ministry. Another very brave action he did was in one of his daily tours at the National Stadium. He was alerted from a Uruguayan man that there were 58 Tupamaros that were about to be executed. And he managed to get a list. Somehow, we don't know how this list finally got to him, but he managed to get a list with those 58 names. He asked for a meeting with Espinosa and started to negotiate about this. But he wouldn't, of course he wouldn't let them free. But then one evening, he knew that Espinosa had another meeting. And he left Mayor Mario Lavandero in charge, and then he came to action. And started to negotiate about getting those 58 Tupamaros free. He was very convincing. He said that Sweden that he had been in contact with the government, and they were happy it was a great opportunity and invitation to bring those Tupamaros to Sweden. And the staff had been instructed that they would be very confident in the whole operation, so no one would ask any questions. So he arrived with minibuses and managed to get them out. And the Major Lavandero was executed the next morning. Other crazy things he did was like inviting the highest generals in the military junta for a party in the embassy. And during the dinner, he actually smuggled in the private secretary of President Allende in the house. But then he knew they would be there and they were relaxed, drinking, and he managed to bring her into the house. But he was not very, they didn't appreciate his actions. And finally, it came to a brutal end with a fist fight with the generals at the hospital in Santiago when he was trying to get an operation for a Uruguayan lady, Mirta Fernandez. And they wouldn't let her have surgery. So he was finally declared persona non grata and thrown out of the country. But before he left Chile, in the beginning of December 1973, he had managed to rescue more than 1,500 people from persecution, death, prison, and torture. He was a man with great pathos for justice. In his justice as a diplomat, he showed the fight for human rights should not be composed of sermons, speeches, or news articles. In a letter he wrote from Chile to his second wife, Natasha, he said, "As you know, my view is that a diplomat does not need to stay in the traditional role of a cool and objective onlooker and analysis. I am a person who becomes strongly involved as here in Chile. I think that our activities are part of the task of an embassy. It's absolutely wrong policy to see the work of an ambassador in a foreign country far away as some sort of retirement post. It is especially in these countries where the embassy should represent the modern Sweden." He also said one of his most famous quotes is, "I cannot tolerate injustice." He was screaming to the military, "You are murderers and history will judge you." And that's where we are today.
Thank you for that. On an earlier version of the program, Ignacio Guevara is listed. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us today. Next speaker, who had the good fortune to meet Harald Edelstam at that time in Chile, together with her husband. Please join me in welcoming Gladys Leichtle.
This story should have been told by the main chapter, but he passed away for almost 6 years now. Today my name is Leichtle. 1973. My name was Gladys Valentina Rosa Gonzalez. I am 73 years old, and my soulmate should have been 74 today. 50 years ago, I live in Valdivia, a city in the Lake District in southern Chile, about 800 kilometers from the capital. My family was composed of 2 girls, 1 and 3 years old, and my husband, Erwin Leichtle, whom I have met as a student at the electrical engineering faculty of the Universidad Técnica del Estado, Filial Valdivia, in 1969. We married in 1970, the same year Dr. Salvador Allende became Chile's president. Erwin was a member of the board of student committee at our university. Later, he was a member of the board of engineers in Valdivia. Politically, he belongs to the left and participated in many debates and activities in Valdivia. Therefore, he was well known in the political circles in Valdivia. He graduated in August 1972 with outstanding records. Immediately, he was offered the position as technical director of the telecom company serving the southern regions of Chile. September 11, 1973 was a working day. Erwin left the work early. Soon after, I heard through the radio the voice of our president and the noise of the coup taking place in Santiago. Erwin called me around 7:30 to tell me to remain calm and not send our oldest daughter to the kindergarten. He said, the military is arriving at the company offices, and that he was the only board member on site. They called a meeting. Around 10, same night. He returned home, and I saw through the window an armored vehicle behind the company car. He stayed with me for 2 hours, and we talked about what could happen. He said, "They may arrest me." At night, it was midnight. He knocked on the door. I hugged. And he was gone. They took him to the main police office, where he was formally arrested. At that time, I had 2 brothers who served as police officers in the same city. My oldest brother was on duty that night and saw Erwin when he arrived. Early the next morning, my brother passed by and told me that he had been taken to the military headquarters. My brother promised me to keep me informed about Erwin as long as he could. My husband was accused of intention of sabotage and insulting the armed forces. Sabotage was a crime that was punished with a capital execution. My husband was tortured, isolated, coerced to admit this crime. Eventually, he has to stand in front of martial court without a defense lawyer and sentenced to 5 years and 60 days in prison. With the help of my brother, Erwin's family, and brave friends, I was able to get an audience with the military commander of the region. And I played to him, "Please, save my husband's life." The commander said, if he is not involved in a plot to overthrow the military junta, he will consider the case. Now a little history you may not know about this. Since the prosecution of the Communist Party in the 1950s in Chile, existed a paragraph in the Constitution that stated that the political prisoner could exchange a sentence for extradition or political asylum. Somebody told me about this possibility. One day I was standing in the queue at the jail entrance, waiting to be allowed to see my husband. Suddenly, the soldiers in charge shouted, "Leave, no visit. Leave, or we will kill you." A tall and blonde man, was at the front of the queue. He tried to argue with the soldiers, and they ordered him to leave or they will shoot him. I heard that this man was speaking in English, and the soldiers only understood Spanish. For some reasons, I felt compelled by the dangers of the situation, and I reached out to him and said, please leave, they will kill you." He said, "I am a representative of the Swedish embassy, and I'm here to take with me a Swedish citizen that is in this prison." He showed his credentials. I translated that to the soldiers, and they allowed him to enter the prison. Before he went in, he gave me his card and said, "Call me if you need help." Soon after that, I heard that the military has changed Erwin's sentences from 5 years in prison to 5 years in exile. The condition being that everything has to be arranged by Erwin and all expenses covered by him. I knew at that time that the sentence meant that Erwin would be transferred to a high security prison in Temuco. The modus operandi of the junta was that during the transfer they will kill the prisoners and argue that they tried to escape. Time was short. I reached out to everyone that could possibly help me in any way. I wrote letters to several embassies asking for help. And of course, I contacted Mr. Johnson. I didn't realize that he was the Swedish embassy consul. I sent all the material I had, and I could. A letter dated November 13 arrived, and it was from the real Ambassador de Swiss. And that is how I came in contact with the ambassador. After several incidents, late in November, my husband reached the embassy where, as Erwin said, a tall and friendly man embraced him and welcomed him to the Swedish territory, Mr. Edelstam. And later on that day, Erwin was taken to the Cuban Chamber of Commerce, which the embassy used as a refugee center. Eventually, the girls and me arrived there too. On December 17, my husband wrote a letter to Carl G. Groth, encargado de negocios del Reino de Suecia, asking him why the safe passage document that we were supposed to have still had not arrived. We couldn't leave. January 11, 1974, we left the refugee center under heavy guard to travel to the airport, and we left Chile the same day. At this point, the ambassador has been declared persona non grata, and Mr. Groth has replaced him. Because of the time zones, we arrived at Atlanta the same day. From there, we traveled directly to the refugee center located in Cannes. The ambassador visited the center some days later on, and there is a photo from that occasion where he is holding.
Thank you, Gladys, for that powerful memoir that also contains so much beauty in the accounts of those who dared to offer help, and that you told it with such detail, and we could really feel present in that time.
And I just I forgot to mention
Please.
that I got a letter, signed it by Ambassador Edelstam. That's why I knew he was the ambassador. Thank you.
For showing us that. We are fortunate to have with us the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Stefan Löfven, a person who in his post-Prime Minister time has been actively engaged in civil society and social movements, in helping strengthen our democracy. As all of you probably know, during the Pinochet regime, labor organizations became illegal, and so to have a top representative of the Swedish labor movement, as well as former Prime Minister, is especially relevant on a day like this. Caroline noted that Olof Palme gave encouragement to Harald Edelstam, and particularly in relation to declaring the Cuban mission to be Swedish territory. But Harald Edelstam was not formally acknowledged for his heroism. It was instead seen as disobedience until Stefan Löfven, as Prime Minister, acknowledged Edelstam's deeds. So with that, please join me in welcoming our former Prime Minister.
Thank you everybody for being here. Such an important day to remember. In September 1973, I was a 16-year-old, or perhaps young, if you like, social democrat. 2 years earlier, I was one of the founders of a local branch of the Social Democratic Youth League, and we were, of course, engaged in many domestic political issues, but the interest for international politics was also very high. When we looked at the East that very year, we noted perhaps the first genuine breakthrough for ending the Vietnam War, although it would turn out that the war continued another 2 years. But that was the sentiment of this time. When we looked at the West, to the West, we saw a very unstable Latin America. Someone has called it the Latin America's dark decades. Long-term military governments with changing leadership in most cases controlled 11 Latin American nations for significant periods from 1964 to 1990. Ecuador, 1963 to 1966 and 72 to 76. Guatemala, 1963 to 1985, with an interlude from 66 to 69. Brazil, 1964 to 1985. Bolivia, 1964 to 1970 and 71 to 1982. Argentina, 1966 to 1973 and 1976 to 1983. Peru, 1968 to 1980. Panama, 1968 to 1989. Honduras, 1963 to 1966 and 1972 to 1982. And in El Salvador, the military dominated the government from 1948 to 1984, but the last episode was from 1979 to 1984. And Uruguay in June 1973, the coup as well. And this dictatorship ended in 1984. Why do I tell all this? Because people have to see the time as it was. And it was a terrible time in many ways for a young social democrat to see what was going on around the world. And then came Chile, September 11th, 1973. Now, the images from that coup in Chile is still so clear to me, because it was devastating to see, although we were not affected, not even close to what we just heard from the testimony, but the feeling was so bad and so dark. The images from the attack on the presidential palace in Santiago de Chile, not least a picture of President Allende in that palace where he was later murdered. The picture with him and the gun. But perhaps most, the horrific reports on killing and torture. One of the testimonies has been given by an, excuse me now if I can't pronounce this right, Lux de las Nieves Ayras Moreno. She was 23 years old when she was arrested for the second time. And what she had to go through in the prison is unbearable to read about it, so it's incredible that she even can testify. She was physically and psychologically abused, tortured. She was forced to watch when her father and her brother was tortured. She was taken outside, and her tormentors pretended that she was shot, because that was also a way of torturing her father and her brother. She later wrote a letter subtitled, "For all women who are not able to speak." And she writes that many people don't know or do not want to be reminded, especially young people and also politicians. But that she tells this story, her story, so that it can never happen again in any place, and so that it is made clear what a military dictatorship really is. It is so important to remember. Keep talking about what actually happened. Keep up the efforts to find the whole truth, not least for families that not yet have had the possibility to say that last farewell to their loved ones. It's important to take time to mourn. And it is also important to try to learn. This is one important example of when evil forces take the right to rule over people's will. They have no right whatsoever to do so, but they don't care. They think they are strong, but they are weak because they are afraid of other opinions and other views. They think that the strong has that right, and that is something that we can never, ever accept. And that is also why it's so important to keep talking about this. The military junta could not just accept the choices of democracy, and sometimes we hear some very bad excuses for taking action from the military side. Bad excuses from authoritarian leaders and dictatorships. But there is no excuse. Disregarding democracy is always wrong. Disregarding all human beings' equal value is always wrong. Taking power with military force is always wrong. Killing people regarded as political adversaries is always wrong. Torturing is always wrong. Making people disappear is always wrong. It's so important to recognize that no one has the right to use abusive behavior against its human fellows. And if it happens, it's important also that justice will be done. The right thing to do is always, always to stand up for democracy, stand up for human rights, for international law, and the UN Charter. We must also acknowledge that the coup in Chile in 1973 is a dark and shameful part of the history of the United States. From the moment President Allende took office, the US was active in combating him, making sure that the economy wouldn't work, creating chaos, to do what it took to bring him down, and it ended with a horrific coup. So there is a lesson for the United States, but there's also a lesson for other big powers to think that they can rule the world without accepting people's will, people's desire for democracy, freedom, wealth, and sustainable true peace. And we see now in our world today, changing global geopolitics, and it means both big powers competing and also combating for power. We see big countries talking about themselves. We see more and more regions in the world talking about themselves, forgetting the world. So we have to, friends, gather under the UN flag. We have to build common security. It was Olof Palme who supported Harald Edelstam in his efforts, also launched the concept of common security. How do we build security together? Not standing as enemies. And that goes between countries. How do countries build security together? That's the best the leaders can deliver to its citizens. That is true security. But also within and inside a country, how do we build common security? So we also see a wish for a world where all nations are respected, where we cooperate, building common security. One strong feeling that came with the coup was a feeling of dark future. And that is, of course, one of the purposes to make our more passive and let the ruling forces decide for us. And as we can see, the result of that is pain, no hope for a brighter future, and we cannot and will not accept a society and a world built on that. We know also there is another path to take. So today, we remember the victims and we pay our respect to them and their families. But let us also remember those who, in the midst of all these darkness, offer some light. One person that impressed also, a 16-year-old young man in Sweden, was of course Harald Edelstam. His legacy must also be remembered because it meant so much for so many individuals in that situation. Just imagine the feeling for those he saved. Because in the middle of the despair, he showed that an individual can make such a difference. And because also that brings hope to all of us. Things can be done. Already in Norway, when he was ambassador in Norway during the Second World War, Harald Edelstam showed you can do things differently if you have the courage, the moral, the integrity, and he did so. It wasn't always approved by the ministry, but he did it anyway, and he saved people in Norway as well. He saved hundreds of Jews, he saved hundreds of resistant fighters, and it was in Norway he got this label, the Black Carnation. So he was known already then. I think he, due to his courage, perhaps when he came back to Sweden, to put it diplomatically, he wasn't really, I think, met with the gratitude that he should have been met with. Methods also in Chile, and saved, so as someone said, perhaps 1,500 people. We must remember that, according to a number that Amnesty International has published, in total more than 30,000 people. If they were killed, they were tortured, they disappeared, they were placed in detention. So that's the number of people that was, and of course their families, their relatives, their friends, everybody was of course affected. And we can argue about different numbers, but this is of course very serious for a country. And in this effort in Santiago de Chile, Harald Edelstam was supported by Olof Palme. I think they had one would have been able to be a fly on the wall and listen to them talking, saying, the focus here is the people that we need to save, not the rules. The focus are always the people. But again, I think, if we look into it, I wonder how Harald Edelstam was received at the Minister of Foreign Affairs when he came back. I think not as the hero that he really is. He was and is. Because he broke some diplomatic boundaries, some red lines, but that really saved so many lives. Now the lasting learning we have is that democracy is never a given thing. democracy is something we have to defend in every moment, every day, every week, every year that we live. Otherwise, we don't know what happens with it. So we have to strengthen democracy. So when it is attacked, it must have more force of resistance. And the other thing is that we have to be determined to do so. And that has been shown by Harald Edelstam. So today we are reminded of a very sad feeling, of broken hopes and dreams, but we are also reminded of the same determination in never giving up. It is about courage, integrity, and morale. I will end with a poem. It's quite long, so please bear with me, but this one is because the theme is undo the coup. This is a poem by a poet called Gonzalo Millán, and he wrote going about backwards. Sometimes go backwards. The people begin to recede. The horses trot backwards. The soldiers break ranks. The bullets leave the flesh. The officer put back their guns. The bullets enter the gun barrels. The electricity returns through the courts and goes out through the plugs. Those who were being tortured stop shaking. Those who were being tortured close their mouths. Those who disappeared appear. The dead leave their graves. The planes fly backwards to land on the North American aircraft carriers. The rockets rise back up to the planes. La Moneda makes itself whole again. Allende fires his gun. He comes out on the balcony. He takes off his helmet. His skull mends itself. Allende goes back to Tomas Moro Street. Those who were arrested leave the stadium backwards. The boats and planes return with their refugees. Chile is a democratic country. The army respects the constitution. The soldiers return to their barracks. Neruda is reborn. He returns to Isla Negra in an ambulance. His prostate is painful. He writes. Victor Jara plays the guitar and sings. Speeches enter the mouths. Pinochet embraces Prat. He disappears. Prat lives again. The copper again belongs to Chile. Those who lost their jobs are rehired. The workers are marching, singing Venceremos. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Stefan Löfven, for those eloquent reflections from your 16-year-old self and later. I appreciated it especially that you reminded us of the United States' role in the coup in Chile, something that has become clearer and clearer with the release of some U.S. government documents as recently as this summer. And the contrast that you pointed to between the imperial arrogance of the great powers and the Swedish visions of common security that have been put forth and ignored by the world. Your speech was a counterbalance to the feeling of a dark future that you described, that we might as well just give up because the tyrants will win. We come then to our next guest, who had a very salient historical role in the process of undoing the coup, so to speak. And that is Dr. Carlos Castresana-Fernandez, who is joining us by video link, and he is the former prosecutor of the Supreme Court of Spain and author of the initial lawsuits in 1996 that brought Pinochet to justice before the Spanish Audiencia Nacional and also the British House of Lords. He is also the former head of the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Castresana-Fernandez.
Thank you, obviously, to the Nordic Institute of Latin American Studies of the University of Stockholm for organizing this event. Also, naturally, Caroline Edelstam and the Edelstam Foundation for the opportunity of inviting me here. And I want to salute some of the people I know. They are there, especially the Ambassador of Spain, Cristina La Torre, and maybe Eva Bernardalin and some other friends from Stockholm. And thank you for the opportunity. I think it is an important day to commemorate the coup in Chile in 1973 because it marked our lives in many different ways, and not only for the Chileans but for people all around the world. And I wanted to begin with this. I was a teenager when the coup happened, and giving God thanks for having Chile. You will remember that Spain was a dictatorship at the same time as well. And then the course ended in April '74, and the priest brought us again to the church to pray again, in this case because the sister country, Portugal, was in deep danger. And I had not political conscience at the time, but when I could see the images of General Pinochet in one side, the supposed saviors, according so gentle as the young soldiers of the Portuguese Revolution. So we could say that it was the birth of my political conscience in a very initial step. But I think that what happened 50 years ago, taking into account what had happened in 1948 and what happened after that in 1998. The governments come from the respect and ensure these fundamental rights. This was a social contract. It was expanded all around the globe. It was the democratic society. The representatives were elected by citizens, but the representatives didn't get the legitimacy of having been elected, of respecting and ensuring the effective enjoyment of fundamental rights. And this was established during one century and a half without changes until 1945. In 1945, the international community realized that most of the victims in the Second World War had perished victims of their own governments. These governments that, according to this domestic social contract, should have been protecting them, but instead they were persecuting them on racial, political grounds and exterminating them. Then the international community understood that this paradigm of domestic social contract had to change. The Charter of the United Nations established for the first time the right of the international community to intervene in the government and the citizen, but the government being responsible before the international community if they not fulfill their duties to respect and to ensure. What happened is that at the very same time of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the Cold War was starting, and then the declaration remained for many years just like a declaration without any kind of effective practical consequences. In fact, when we were able to create a real mandatory convention for the protection of human rights, we had to do two conventions. The International Pact of Civil and Political Rights and the International Pact of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Because the world was divided at the time in two blocks of hegemonical influence, the Western led by the United States, the Eastern led by the Soviet Union. So we continued this false distinction between civil and political rights and economic and social rights divided, and in the Western countries you could enjoy your civil and political rights, but you have not guaranteed your economic and social rights. And in the area of influence of the Soviet Union, on the contrary, there were many social services, but there were not political freedom. So in my understanding, what happened in 1973 in Chile was this: the President Allende, through democratic means, tried to bring to the political arena economic and social and cultural rights, nationalizing the industry of extraction of the copper, trying to bring some social benefits to the majority of the population that, even being a democratic country in Chile, could not enjoy the basic economic, social and cultural rights, housing, education, health, work, etc. And it was not permitted during the Cold War. So the question is that establishing a social state, even in a democratic manner, in the Western Hemisphere was not permitted. It was a very bad example, and for this, the democracy in Chile had to be destroyed. It has been already mentioned, but it's a very sad event that the oldest democracy in Southern America was destroyed with the critical contribution of the oldest democracy of North America. But it is what happened. Then the message sent to the world at the time in 1973 was this: blocks are not divisible. Chile belongs to the Western side, and then a socialist government will be not permitted. And the cost of this, we all know, the many violations of human rights, 1,200 forced disappearances, dozens of thousands of people in prison, 30,000 people tortured, hundreds of thousands of Chileans going to exile. So the cost in the violation of human rights was enormous, and we have to commemorate this today, but not in a very negative sense, because Chile in many ways has made the task that they had to do. So this situation stayed the same during 17 years, but the first and only time that General Pinochet asked the Chileans if they wanted him to continue in the power, they said, no, you have to go. And this was the transition. This is what I call the first Chilean transition. It happened in 1990, there were elections, they recovered the suffrage, the possibility of electing their representatives, and this was an enormously important part. But the other pillar of democracy, democratic states, are because of the suffrage, because of the election of the representatives, but because of the legality. The part of legality could not be restored because the impunity and the guarantees of added immunity for General Pinochet and all his cronies. First, the immunity as head of state, then his immunity as head of the army, then his immunity as senator for life, made impossible in Chile any kind of demand for accountability for his responsibilities in the coup, in the violation of human rights for so many years. But then we, the progressive prosecutors in Spain, decided to bring a lawsuit before the Audiencia Nacional in order to check if the Cold War had ended, if the world had changed, if the international law of human rights could be permitted to work. And yes, what basically we did was taking the Nuremberg principles, establishing the responsibility for international crimes universally, getting them out of the freezer, where they have been 50 years during the Cold War, and putting them in the microwave to see if it worked, and it worked. And then in 1998, General Pinochet, against any possible prediction, was arrested in London. London was submitted to a process for his extradition to Spain, and then also to France, to Switzerland, and to another country, I don't remember exactly. But the process was important and was possible because Cold War had ended. So between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Twin Towers, we live like in a decade of honeymoon in the international community, and the members of the different governments in the Security Council permitted international law to be applied. This is the decade when the Yugoslavia Tribunal was created, when the Rwanda Tribunal was created, when the International Criminal Court was created, and when General Pinochet was arrested. And it was the beginning of the second transition of Chile, because when he came back to Chile in 2000, 500 days after his arrest, the country was a different one. The doors of the courts of justice had been finally opened for the victims, and justice could be pursued also in Chile. And for this reason, he was indicted, he was prosecuted, he died, but it is not the important thing. The important thing is that it was the starting point of the second transition of Chile, bringing not only the electoral freedom, but also the legality to the constitution of the country. So now Chile, and we have seen in the last weeks, has been able to convict the murderers of Victor Jara by the Supreme Court, and the murderers of Carmelo Soria, the most important case for us in Spain, because he was a Spain nationality, he was an international officer of the United Nations living in Chile. He was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in 1976, appearing as an accident, but we know he was a murderer, and the perpetrators of this murder have been convicted in the Supreme Court of Chile like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we have the situation, 1948, the Universal Declaration was approved. 1973, the Universal Declaration was obviously, self-evidently violated by Pinochet and his cronies. 1998, justice began to be done, and today we can celebrate that 24 years later, Chile is a real democracy with a principle of legality and with all the political freedoms. And this is the challenge nowadays, because in my way, this discussion about the elaboration and approval of a new constitution for Chile is the third transition, because Chile still has the very conservative and very also in the economic sense, conservative constitution approved by the dictator as an heritage for Chileans in 1980. There had been an attempt of elaborating a new constitution that failed 2 or 3 years ago, and now they are in process of elaborating another constitution. I think that this is the contribution we can make to the commemoration of the coup d'etat. There was a rule in 1948. This rule was violated in 1973. The responsibility for this violation was requested in 1998, but today they are in the same pending issue of the Declaration of Human Rights 1948, because there are not only civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. Today, still many millions of Chileans have not granted the economic, social, and cultural rights. So this is clearly the task ahead. Let's hope that the politicians and the civil society in Chile be able to get an agreement to approve a new constitution where making honor to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be recognized for everyone in Chile with equality before the law, the civil and political rights, but also the economic, social, and cultural rights, the right to a dignified life at the end. So this is my contribution. Thank you very much.
These commemorations in the larger history of human rights, and for your own role in that history, for, as you said, taking the Nuremberg principles from the freezer to the microwave. With that, we open to questions. How did Harald Edelstam's and Sweden's acts of rescue change Sweden, change Swedish identity, perhaps change the meaning of what it means to be a diplomat or a representative of Sweden in international settings?
I'm not sure it changed dramatically. It emphasized. Yeah, it changed, of course. I mean, the as I said, the courage that Harald Edelstam showed, that you have to act perhaps outside the boundaries, because this is about saving people. And with strengthen, I mean that I think it strengthened the feeling that a small country also can make a difference in the world. So we are a small country, a little more than 10 million, but I've seen during my time as Prime Minister also that Sweden and the Nordic, to be honest, I mean, the Nordic is important. It's important for others to see, so that you can show something, you can show that courage, that determination also as a small country, and that counts. So I've seen many proofs of that, but of course I remember very clearly myself when I watched this first the horrific picture of the tanks and all that, and the attack on the presidential palace, as I said, but also the fight afterwards, what it really meant, and it encouraged also us back here in Sweden to try to support in every way. We made sure that we could send money, support Chile in different ways, and the Chilean people. So, but I think mainly it strengthened the awareness that also as a small country you can make a difference.
That two small countries, one in the south of the Edelstam and one in the north, strengthened the democracy of the world. And that's what happened through the work of Edelstam, that put democracy and diplomacy at the front. And the fact that the Chilean people never fight each other with arms, but with words, prevailed. And we never had a real war, as Pinochet said. So I think that was very contributing to where we are today.
I think generally when I meet other diplomats, I think they are very strengthened and intrigued by the courage, and also inspired to actually take responsibility themselves. And I know we have some diplomats here today, so I hope they get inspired by all our Swedish diplomat heroes. There are many, Raoul Wallenberg, Folke Bernadotte, Harald Edelstam. So I think we have a strong heritage of heroes, diplomatic heroes in Sweden.
We open now to questions.
Needed to take it out from the freezer and put into the microwave and into action. What are we supposed to do in this time when also fascism and anti-democratical ideas are not only brought out of the freezer but also put into action, not only here in Sweden but in all over the world? What can we do domestically and internationally in this time with the learnings from the past?
Thank you. I want to give Carlos an opportunity, if you'd like to respond, because you're sort of remote from the rest of us. Could you hear the question?
Yes. My connection was interrupted, but I was able to come back. Well, I don't know what we should do. I think that we should act not only in the field that is very specific of international critical way, and the civil society has an enormously important role in protecting democracy. We need to exercise democracy, all our fundamental rights, and we need to defend the values of the principles contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights everywhere. We, the lawyers, can continue doing this exercise of universal jurisdiction when we are addressing very, very serious violations of human rights, because it is our right, but it is also our duty, because victims have a fundamental right to access to jurisdiction, and in many cases, unfortunately, this fundamental right to claim for justice against the perpetrators and for reparation for the victims are denied in the very same places where the violations have occurred. So for this reason, we in the international community accepted that universal jurisdiction should be exercised in any circumstances when the victims so denied this fundamental right to justice, in addition to the previous violation of the rights to life, physical and mental integrity, freedom, etc. We have now one case in Stockholm that began 1 week ago, the Lundin case against an oil company that profited of the oil revenues in an area of conflict, knowingly, supposedly, according to the accusation, that they knew that the government of Sudan was violating the human rights in the area where they were extracting the oil. These kind of actions brought in courts of justice of democratic countries where there is a reasonable level of independence of the judiciary is the way ahead for us. But I think that it is not only a work for lawyers or prosecutors, it's a work for everyone. Everyone must fight to their personal capacity in their job, in their activity, and as citizens of the democratic societies in promoting justice, fundamental rights, and not only, I insist, civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights that in many cases are in the roots of every conflict, because societies cannot continue living submitted to dictatorial regimes that deny them the fundamental rights. So I think that we lawyers should continue to the best of our capacity to protect fundamental rights in the courts of justice, but that the protection of human rights is a task for everyone.
Thank you. Further comments on this question of protecting democracy and the lessons from Chile?
We have to be much more clear what this is all about. We have a growing fascism today, authoritarianism today, and we have as people to make sure that we understand that this is only about conquering by division. You divide and you conquer. That's everything about fascism. So we have to stand up for the equal value, the human value of everybody, and talk more about the more we can cooperate. Also, that's why I'm talking about the common security, not only between countries, also within the country. Because what they say is, we see it here in Sweden, but what they say is, a Sami cannot be a Swede as well. Questioning whether you can be a Jew and a Swede at the same time. Saying clearly in that, well, of course, people should govern the country, but the question is who belongs to these people. So we have to stand up 100%, not give in an inch, not a millimeter, not just nothing. The equal value must stay there. Because the moment we don't stand up for that, and that's fascism not standing up for that, the moment we have to ask ourselves, okay, who doesn't have the equal value? What does it mean? And who will decide? There's always be one or two who will be very keen on deciding who is not worthy. And if you remember the poem, I think it was written by, no, that wasn't Srebrenica. Anyway, it goes something like this: when they came for the communists, I didn't say anything because I was not a communist. When they came for the socialists, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a socialist. When they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. When they came for me, there was nobody left to protest. So stick together, that we must be very clear on that. This is about the equal human value. And if we protect that, and then of course there's a lot of activities that we can engage in, making sure that. But I think the basic foundation is the equal value of all human beings. That's what we need to stand up for.
About as well that the human rights exist for the people who need them, and many times you don't think every day about your actual human rights and what are your rights. Many people are not even aware of their rights because they haven't been in need of them. So I think as well there will come a time where people will start to ask about their rights again, and then they will by themselves be reinforced. And we should continue, the ones aware of our rights should actually continue to tell people which human rights are violated about their rights, so then they will become stronger. That's why it's always important to talk about human rights, and we see today that the democratic space is shrinking, human rights are not on the agenda with the same strength it used to be. You don't hear much about the human rights being violated in Ukraine now, for instance. So let's talk about it and talk about it and talk about it.
For your interesting contributions, very valuable. And it's not a question, it's more a kind of historical remark, and it's linked to what Carlos just said also about that we have the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights today. And actually, a lawyer from Chile, Hernan Santa Cruz, who was actually a very good friend of Salvador Allende, he was one of the main authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And he was probably the delegate who emphasized social economic rights most fiercely, strongly. So I think Hernan Santa Cruz is actually a person that we also can remember today, and also in his friendship to Salvador Allende.
Thank you for inviting us to this important event to bring light to this important day of history. And this day also has other important events. For instance, when we talk about, we can speak about important, courageous people making good efforts for human rights and for people. And Anna Lindh was also one of them. And unfortunately, she was killed very early, and she was a foreign minister, Sweden at that time. But I want to know, what would you like to say for how is it important, how is it possible to be a courageous diplomat and stakeholder in the international community? What kind of advices do you have to people involved within that community? Thank you.
Of course, you have to have also governments with courage. At the end of the day, the governments are sending out the signals. What are we supposed to stand up for? What are our messages? So I think at the end of the day, it's that. And that is why I said earlier, we need to gather under the UN flag. We are too much on our own right now, and I think that's not possible. Not least making sure that we also remember the Declaration of Human Rights, because if you read that, it's a very strong message. It's a very strong message in the UN Charter. So we have so much already in place, but we also have to stand up for it and say, this is what we need to focus on. Today we focus on different regions' economic strength, competing with others, and competition is not a bad thing. It's not about that, but when it ends up in regions and countries isolating themselves, that's where we are in a dangerous place in the world, and we are there right now. So we see this huge change in geopolitics, and nobody is saying, hey, let's gather on the UN flag and sort this out, because we need to do that. There's no way of handling the climate transition that is needed without working together globally. There's no way of we can't manage perhaps now next health crisis without working together globally. We can't make sure that the world is safe from nuclear weapons until we work together globally. So there's so many issues, child labor, democracy, you mentioned, everything needs to be handled together globally. Then we can use the regions as tools, as mechanisms to reach that. But the global perspective needs to get back. I think that's perhaps the most important signal that governments can send to their representatives all over the world.
Yeah, that for an individual diplomat who is thinking of the kind of professional disobedience that Harald Edelstam undertook, some of the things that we see in his life, looking for allies early on, finding people one can trust within the diplomatic service or outside to confide in, try not to be working totally alone, documenting what one has done so that if there are later court cases against you or so, that you have material to show why you were acting as you were. And then maybe also thinking about under what circumstances is something even more important than your continued career. What might be worth losing one's job for, or risking one's career for, and having that clear in one's mind. Could be a few lessons from Edelstam's example. We continue with the next question, or comment, or protest. Please.
Nice in this seminary. It's not a question that I'm going to put, but I'm going to name two persons that exemplify the labor of brave Swedish diplomats. I get emotional, I'm sorry. Sten Rylander in Africa, with a very discreet job, but very strong, that maybe contributed to the independence of Namibia and the liberation of South Africa from apartheid and other things in Ethiopia. He did it very quiet but very courageous, and he didn't hesitate to break the rigidity of diplomats sometimes. Another one is Anders Koppes, who denounced the sexual violations by courageous French soldiers. It cost him his place at the High Commission for Refugees. And after he was ambassador in Guatemala, where he made a fantastic job and defended human rights and the money that go with that destination. And he's retired now. But those are two examples, but there are several. And I think it's somehow in the Edelstam way. Thank you.
Organizing this seminar, I think it's been super interesting. My question kind of comes from me thinking about two themes that I've kind of recognized in the seminar. Well, one of them is obviously, well, we're honoring a hero, Harald Edelstam, but also other heroes now with us in Chile, of course, also here in Sweden. And another theme that I'm thinking about is what Stefan has said about being, we're trying to fight for democratic rights in a global sense. So my question kind of regards what is, or reflections upon what is the role of Sweden right now? How do you see it in today's world, in the international arena? If you have any comments or reflections, because now I see the world, and I guess increasingly more, maybe more multipolar, instead of like more blocks, so powerful blocks, kind of like fighting for power. And if I do a reflection of how Sweden was maybe in the 60s, 70s, well, I wasn't born there, but I see Sweden maybe as was more of a humanitarian, or had a lot of soft power, a beacon for hope. And I don't know if that's the case right now, or if you had any comments on how you would see Sweden now in an international perspective.
Now, it is a very good question, because we're in the midst of this geopolitical change, as you say, more multipolar world. So right now it's very important to watch out, because if we continue the path we're on now, the world, we might end up in a similar situation that was described by George Orwell in his book 1984. And that's not a good future. So first, I think Sweden needs to stay clear, and obvious with what we want to achieve. Of course, we're now in the European Union since many years, so that is our common foreign policy forum, and that's a good thing because that also gives the voice more power. And in doing so, I think it's very important to emphasize that Europe needs to continue playing the role of not this side or that side of the world, but make sure that we have a balance so that we do not end up in George Orwell's 1984. We have to make sure that that's why I keep saying, gather under the UN flag. And that is a key message. But also in doing so, make sure that we can handle the climate change, the climate transition that is, and health issues and all those issues, so that people see the global cooperation is something good for me. It is something good, and I think more leaders need to say to their citizens that this global cooperation is good for us as well. It's not just handing out something to someone else. This is very, very good for us. I think that's an important message from Sweden, also in the world. So never forget that also, again, small countries can make a difference. And I think we should be open with it. I think we should advocate for denuclearization. I think the nuclear weapons have had its time. I think that the so-called mutual assured destruction, which is a basic strategy for these nuclear states, is devastating. Mutual assured destruction is not security. That is, you're assured that we can destroy one another. So mutual assured destruction is MAD, it's mad. Go from that to mutual assured survival. Those kind of messages I think Sweden can deliver. I think we should, and I think we should use the European Union as a forum. I think we should have our place in the United Nations, making sure that we defend the global issues.
Thinking about that it will be important with responsibility, and this will actually affect, in regard to the climate change, we are going to have to work together, because this will be a huge international crisis in regard to peace and security, when people have to move and from rural areas, or they have to change countries because of the temperature. So I think we will come to a point where there is no other solution than for a corporation and responsibility.
Thank you.
Two things that have been discussed here, and I think diplomacy and the global attitude that we have today in society not always go together, but please continue fighting for what is real democracy, which is equal rights, humanity, and cooperation, because that is what will keep us alive in this planet.
It's in the same idea. Some examples have been made. Obviously, Harald Edelstam is one of them. I've listened that Anders Kompass has been mentioned. They are diplomats, but there are also lawyers and prosecutors and judges, but there are professionals or human beings everywhere. And I think that the important thing is the commitment of everyone for the basic human rights for everyone. And this will make the difference, because we live in a very complicated world, but it has always been like that. The dangers have been different in different times. The critical situations have been in different latitudes, but the rule of law at the international level is always the reference. What is permitted, what is not permitted. What we have seen in Ukraine, we saw in 2003 in Iraq. And the reaction this time has been very good with Ukrainian refugees in the European Union, but not that good with Syrian refugees, for example. So these kind of double standards, how the situation in Libya was referred to the International Criminal Court and the situation in Syria was not, is the kind of things that make us weak. So the rules are the same for everyone, and we need to work, any of us, in our specific field to this principle of legality to domestic and to international level and equal for everyone, because it is the only way of having civilized societies coexisting peacefully and where controversies are solved with the instruments of rule of law instead of resorting to violence or to corruption. So in most of the situations we live of violence or controversy around the world is because the fundamental principles of human rights are not enforced, are not respected, and there is not reaction enough of the civil society there or internationally to fight for having these principles respected. So this is the task ahead for every one of us.
This is a question for you, Carlos. What do you think, how can a country be both resilient and strong as a democracy through the constitutional principles and other law to be strengthened? Because if there's one thing what you can do internationally, but what can each country do through law and constitutional principles to be strengthened as a democracy?
Probably a combination of the two things that have been said here today. So it was Salvador Allende himself who said the history is ours and belongs to people. So there are human societies that need to organize themselves to preserve the fundamental values. In the case of the European Union, for example, I must mention also the migrants coming from Eastern Europe and also from Africa through the Mediterranean, and it is a tragedy, and we are doing not really very much as a society in Europe in order to denounce this situation and to rectify the situation, to force our government. I don't say that it is an easy question to be solved, but it is something that has to be addressed, not in the way that we are seeing in Italy, in Greece, in the Mediterranean these days of migrants that are just undocumented, but we used to call them in the media illegals as justifying what happened to them. And this is something we need to take care of. And at the same time that this is a collective task, I always have believed that there are critical persons, individuals that make the difference because their commitment.
We lost the sound there, Carlos. Just while we're solving the technology, we can take another question, comment, protest. To thank all of you for joining us, for bringing your seriousness about this history to our event, and I especially want to thank our speakers for the open-heartedness, the seriousness, the examples of moral beauty that you gave to us. Thank you. And Thaïs and Caroline Edelstam and the Edelstam Foundation where Stefan and I are also board members, for organizing and sponsoring this event.
Thank you.